Well, here we are in week 3 of our imposed quarantine. Hopefully, wherever you are well. You are social distancing and flattening the curve, and all of these terms that will probably be in your memory here for the decades to come. This week is going to be a little bit different, as we are going to be wrapping up our material for the next exam. So there's not going to be as much in terms of a video this week. We're going to go through chapter 13 on economic growth, and then we'll spend a few minutes, well, a little bit of time anyway, reviewing the problem set. Problem sets are due Thursday, so make sure you get those turned in on time. I'll take those up through the end of the day Thursday, so that'll be 11:59 p.m. on Thursday. I'll send out an email about how the exam is going to work, and we'll see how our attempts here at online test giving go. So what we're going to look at this week primarily is economic growth. Economic growth is, as far as all the macro topics, this is the thing that really is kind of guiding the study of macroeconomics. And we've talked a little bit about economic growth and what that looks like. So let's take a look here at what we mean when we mean economic growth. Actually, there's two graphs that I want to look at in particular. One we just spent last week going through, the aggregate demand and aggregate supply graph, and the other graph is something that we looked at a number of weeks ago in the class. So first, here's aggregate demand, aggregate supply. When we look at growth, what we're talking about in the context of this graph is a very specific shift. So here's our long run aggregate supply curve. Here's the short run aggregate supply curve. And then here is aggregate demand. So aggregate demand isn't really a concern in this particular graph. What we're focusing our attention on is what happens when the long run aggregate supply curve shifts. So it's the long run aggregate supply curve that shows us a change in economic growth. But when the long run curve shifts, the short run curve shifts as well. So to get us back into equilibrium, we're going to have a short run curve shift as well. And this is growth, because look what's going on along the GDP axis. We start right here, and then we move to the right to this point over here. When that happens, what we see is that the natural rate of output increases in other words, that value of y, that y star that we had in our, when we were looking at that equilibrium last week, that y star increases to a new level. It goes from y star here to y star 2 right here. That's our natural rate of output. And that's a permanent shift when the long run curve shifts. And that's really the important thing here. We looked at changes in output as a result of these shifts in the curve when we were looking at the basic aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, but everything would eventually revert back to the long run. Here, this is a permanent change. There's been something that changes fundamentally in the economy that moves that curve to the right. So that's one way of looking at economic growth, is this permanent shift in the long run aggregate supply curve. Now, if we were to go back in time, at least back in time in this class, a ways, we could see another view of how economic growth is portrayed by economists. We're going to go back to this particular graph and let's just put these two goods on the axes. We're going to have consumption goods here on the horizontal axis, and we're going to put investment goods on this axis, on the vertical axis. And the curve that we use to show these changes in production possibilities looks something like this. We called it the production possibilities curve. So this is the production possibilities view of growth. And for growth to happen in the production possibilities world, we needed that curve to shift outward. Because remember, when we looked at production possibilities, we had a dot on the curve that represented a certain combination of the two goods on our axes. And we said, well, it would be nice to get to an amount out here, but we weren't able to. There was something preventing us from getting there. But when the curve shifts, so when the production possibilities curve shifts outward, then we can get to that green dot, and that green dot represents more of both goods that is now attainable due to some shift in the underlying economy. So it could be that there are either more resources or some technology shifts. We talked about those kinds of things in the context of production possibilities. Either one of these is a view of economic growth, which is a good thing for an economy for the most part. So now we've looked at two models of economic growth. But instead of looking at graphs, we can see that economic growth is potentially incredibly dramatic and potentially life-altering if we were to compare states of the world before the growth and after the growth. So let's take a look at one picture of economic growth here that illustrates potentially some otherworldly view of economic growth. So here what we have is a picture of a part of the Earth from a satellite. And what I want you to pay attention to is this area right here. This area seems to be kind of separate from the rest of this part of the world. It almost looks like it's an island in the middle of kind of this vast blackness. But if you look much closer, what you will see is that there's a little bit of something going on right in here. It's almost like there's a shadow of something right there, but a shadow that's kind of, well, it's hidden. It's kind of like a shadow in the dark. That shadow is basically a land bridge between this area here and the rest of this continent over here. This particular area right here, this area that is lit up, is actually South Korea. Across the sea, or across this black space, is Japan. And over here, we have China. And actually up here we have China. Which leaves our area of, sort of our shadow area, this area where it looks like somebody might have turned the lights out. That is our area of course, of North Korea. This area of North Korea is so interesting because other than this part right here, which is Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea, there is very little light at night. And that raises an interesting question. What's going on in North Korea? Why does South Korea look like it is, like every house in the country has a light on, but in North Korea, only a couple of places are able to have light at night? Look at Japan. I mean, the whole island here, the whole nation of all these islands, it's lit up like a Christmas tree. And even so much of China is bright at night. But North Korea is just this black hole almost of nothing. And the answer to that question is, in large part, the answer of economic growth. South Korea and North Korea aren't that different in terms of populations, in terms of resources, but the degree to which these two countries are separated in terms of economics is like night and day. There's a close-up of that North Korean peninsula, and there again is North Korea, separated from South Korea by decades of lack of economic growth. So why is North Korea like that? What's keeping the lights off in North Korea? Well, let's start to explore that and before we do that, let's take a look at one more set of pictures. So those are pictures from space. Here's a picture from a particular spot alongside a river. Here we have a nice kind of quaint river town. And there's lots of green space over here. There is lots of, some river traffic. The buildings are there. They're not incredibly tall, but they look modern enough. This is actually a picture of a city around the 1980s. And here's a picture of that city today, taken from almost exactly the same spot along the river. We have our river, we have a little bit of boat traffic, but these two places, here and here, don't look like they are from the same planet. But it's the same city about 40 years apart. Actually, a little bit less than 40 years apart. This is Shanghai, China. And we can see that there has been something going on in Shanghai. And what economists say is that this city has experienced a lot of economic growth. Now, the question of whether the growth is good or not is an entirely reasonable one. But there is no doubt that the economic growth experienced in Shanghai has fundamentally transformed that somewhat bucolic and idyllic little river town into one of the most impressive, most advanced cities on the face of the earth. That's what we talk about. That's what we mean when we talk about economic growth. There are fundamental changes. There are improvements of the standard of living in the lives of people. So there's some just incredibly dramatic pictures of what economic growth looks like. So the first thing we want to do is we want to be able to, as we examine economic growth and what causes economic growth, we want to be able to measure it. We've talked a little bit about this idea as well. Economic growth is a measure of a change in the real GDP per person. So we're looking very specifically here at real GDP. And remember, when we talk about real GDP, we are talking about the inflation adjusted GDP. So we're taking these numbers and we are adjusting them for changes in price. But now we're also going to be doing something else. We're going to be looking at this in terms of per person GDP. And we talked about this when we talked about measuring output. We're looking at this in terms not of what is the country producing as a whole, but what is it producing per person. So we're going to take that real GDP and we're going to divide it by population. So we want to know how many people are in the country. And as we're measuring growth, we're trying to see if there's been a change in this real GDP per person from one year to the next. So we're looking at GDP per person over time. And this is what we mean by economic growth. Has your real GDP per person changed from one year to the next? Now, there's a lot of calculations that we can go through to try to figure this out. But the simplest way of evaluating this is through a fairly basic equation. In fact, we've used this first part of the equation already in our class. Nominal GDP minus the inflation rate. So we use this to calculate the real GDP. But now what we want to do is we want to add that component of per person, that component of GDP that is taking into account what's going on with your population. So what we're going to do is we're going to take that real GDP and subtract the population growth. So this is the change in your population over time. So we'll take nominal GDP minus inflation minus the population growth. So let's take a look at a couple of different numbers here to illustrate what this looks like. Let's say we have a country with a 10% nominal GDP. Now 10% is pretty good for any country in terms of GDP, but remember, if we just look at the nominal GDP, we're missing something. We want to take into account the change of the rate of inflation, because we want to make sure that our GDP is not measuring price changes, but rather that it's measuring changes in output. So let's say that inflation is 4%. So to figure out the real GDP, we have 10% minus 4%, which gives us 6% real GDP, which isn't bad, but it's not 10%. Still, most countries would bend over backwards to get 6% GDP growth. But we also need to take into account the change in population. So let's say that the change in population is, let's go 2%. So this is a relatively fast-growing country in terms of population. What this means for us then is that the real GDP per person change is not 10%, and it's not 6%. It's actually 4%, which still isn't bad for most countries, but it's a far cry from 10%, and still a pretty far cry from 6%. When we look at real GDP per person, this is the number we need. When we're looking at economic growth, this is the number we need. We need that real GDP per person. It's this number that helps us to understand how quickly standards of living are changing in a country. Now, 4% to 6% and even up to 10% may not seem like that big of a deal. But these numbers are actually extraordinarily important and have immense impact on how quickly the standard of living of a country can change. Let's take a look at why that is, why these seemingly insignificant small numbers can have such monumental impacts in terms of economic growth and changing people's standards of living. All right, so we want to use this tool, something called the Rule of 70. The Rule of 70 tells us why even small changes in growth are still really, really important. The rule of 70 tells us how long it takes for an income to double. How long does it take, not to get to the center of a Tootsie Pop, but how long does it take for income to double? The rule of 70 tells us that, and it tells us that in a mathematical way, but in a fundamentally important way. To do that, to figure that out, we take 70 and divide it by the growth rate. So, if you have a growth rate of 0%, we're going to take 70 and divide it by 0, and that's going to tell us how many years it takes for GDP to double. Well, if you remember your math, you're not supposed to divide by 0 because this gives you infinity, which makes sense in the context of our growth rate here. If you never grow, it doesn't matter how many years out into the future we go, you're not going to change your income. So with 0 as your growth rate, it's going to take you infinity years to double your income. But let's say that your growth rate is, instead of 0 years, just 1 year. Well, that tells you that 70 divided by 1, that your income will double in 70 years. Now, 70 seems like a long time, but it's far less time than infinity. So even just a 1% change in the rate of growth can have an enormous impact. Basically, what this is saying is that your income will double in 70 years, your real income. So you will have twice as much income in 70 years, which is basically a generation, well, a couple of generations. If we were to change that growth rate to 2%, then we take 70 divided by 2, and now it only takes 35 years for your income to double. So a 2% growth rate means that in your working life, your income will double. If you start off with a job that's paying you $50,000 a year, by the time you're ready to retire, you're going to be earning $100,000 in real income. Of course, we can continue to add numbers to this. Let's say we look at a rate of growth of 5%. 70 divided by 5 is 14 years. So in your working life, you might see income double 2 or even 3 times if the growth rate is 5%. So these small changes in real GDP per person, and remember that's what this is, that's real GDP per person. Even small changes in real GDP per person can have huge impacts on the lives of people over time. Going from a 1% rate of growth to a 2% rate of growth to a 5% rate of growth, it doesn't seem like that's a huge difference, but it is, because this idea of rule of 70 tells us how long it takes income to double. And the bigger your growth rate, the less time it takes that income to change. All right, so let's get to the crux of the issue here. Economic growth is important for a country. You don't want to stagnate. You don't want to be the same country you were 100 years ago. So what promotes economic growth? Well, the first thing that economists think of and have included in the theory and the models that they have built on economic growth includes resources. When we're talking about resources, we're really talking about the factors of production, or just the inputs into the production process. So we're talking about land and labor and capital. These are our inputs into production. And those are really, really important. They include things like the natural resources. So we see that countries that have lots of natural resources have the ability, they tend to grow faster than other countries. They certainly have the ability to do that. But those aren't the only kinds of resources that are important. Physical capital is important. And for a while, this was the main focus of economic growth theory. The idea of physical capital, just having the tools, the machinery, the things that you needed to promote economic growth, kind of the man-made things that are used to build other things. So if we think about natural resources historically, you can think about countries that would explore to find more natural resources. So we see the nations of Europe in the 15 and the 1600s going out and looking for more natural resources. Physical capital tended to be the focus of economic growth in the I would say from the 1940s through probably the 1960s or so. Economists were really, really interested in how physical capital played into economic growth. And so there were attempts, or you might even call them experiments, where huge amounts of physical capital were sent to poor countries to help them to grow. But just like natural resources, if you have lots of physical capital, it doesn't mean you're going to grow. It just means you have lots of tools. If people aren't there to maintain them, if people don't really know how to use them, then they just end up being wasted. So a movement was made to focus the development of human capital, focus on the development of human capital to see what role that would play. So we see these great moves, especially in Asia, to really develop educational systems, to promote the skills and the quality of labor. So human capital, this is basically your skills, your experience, your knowledge base, your education. These are things that help to improve the quality of labor. And human capital is extraordinarily important. And we see, in fact, in some parts of Asia, particularly Singapore and Hong Kong and South Korea and Taiwan, countries that don't have much by way of natural resources or even physical capital, develop their human capital and were able to grow really, really quickly. So for a long time, it was thought that, well, human capital must be the answer. You need some natural resources, you maybe need a little bit of physical capital, but human capital, that's where it's at. But that may not be all there is to it either. Resources are really important, and some countries with natural resources grow really, really steadily and consistently. But some countries don't. Some countries with physical capital grow very steadily and consistently, but some countries don't. We can just look back at the old Soviet Union for that. The physical capital was there. This was a huge effort on the part of the government to promote physical capital. But they didn't grow very well. Human capital is incredibly important, but sometimes what you end up doing is just educating your population, and then they get smart enough to leave. You might need something else. One of the other things that helps to promote economic growth is technology. Technology is basically, or can be thought of basically, as just your knowledge, the knowledge base that the people possess. Technology is available knowledge. And so it's knowledge by way of how do you produce things? What's the knowledge that's available for use in production? So it's more than just your iPads and the internet. It's a knowledge base, and applying that knowledge to production. Technology is extraordinarily important, but sometimes it shows up in weird and unusual ways. Before we get to the last really big piece of what promotes economic growth. I want to show you a picture of technology. Here's a picture of technology. You may be saying to yourself, wait a minute, this is not a particular picture of technology. This is a picture of a cow. And you would be right. This is a cow. But it's not the cow that I want you to pay attention to. What I want you to pay attention to is what's going on around the cow. Now you may say, well, wait, there is another cow. There's a barn. It looks like the cow is just kind of hanging out here. And that's true, but what's the cow laying in? This stuff right here. It turns out that cows, like people, really enjoy laying in the sand. And I bet you didn't know that about cows. In fact, most people don't know that about cows, and most farmers didn't know this about cows until some enterprising farmer laid some sand down in his barn. You see, cows like to be comfortable, and comfortable cows are happy cows. Comfortable cows are happy cows, and the happier the cow, it turns out, the more milk the cow produces. So farmers used to put straw down for the cows to relax in, and then they used to put wood chips down in their barns for the cows to relax in. And somebody said, well, what's softer and nicer and more comfortable than sand? And so farmers are now buying up lots of sand, and the softer the sand, the better, to make those cows really happy so that they produce lots of milk. This is a technology, an application of technology that helps the farmers become more productive. And that's what we really mean by technology and applying technology to help further economic growth. So now back to our list of what promotes economic growth. Clearly resources are important, but so is technology. But perhaps the most important thing that helps to promote economic growth, the thing that economists are most interested in these days, at least for now, are what we call institutions. Institutions can be thought of as the rules of the game. The rules of the game, and those rules of the game apply at a lot of different levels. When we're talking about the rules of the game, we're talking about not just the economic rules of the game, but also the political and social rules of the game, the things that cause our economy to prosper, but also to work well together. When we talk about institutions, we are talking about things like the political and social, and yes, the economic things that people agree upon, that they agree to when they live in society. Now, not all societies are the same, which means not all societies have the same institutions. And if institutions are important in terms of economic growth, and they are, then we should be able to find some institutions that help to promote economic growth more so than other types of institutions. So let me give you a few primarily economic institutions. Well, let's start with something non-economic to begin with. When we're talking about institutions, we might be talking about something like democracy. That is a political institution, just the way we set up our political order. Not all countries are democracies, of course. You could have a dictatorship. And dictators can be incredibly effective in certain kinds of things. In fact, we saw this with coronavirus. In a country like China, which is much more of a dictatorship than a democracy, although we wouldn't call it a pure dictatorship, it was easy just to tell people you're going to stay in your houses, and that would help to prevent the spread of any kind of virus or contagions. And if you don't follow the rules of the dictator, then we put you in jail, or we take you out and do something bad to you. We don't have that kind of setup in a democracy. Things are a lot different. Economically, we see that the institutions that we adopt can lead to, and certainly do lead to, more economic growth than in other parts of the world. So economic institutions are incredibly important in setting up an environment and a framework under which economic growth can happen more consistently and in a more say orderly fashion. One of the things that is absolutely instrumental in terms of economic institutions are property rights. Specifically, private property rights and the protection of those property rights. It's amazing how people will, how creative people can be if they're given the proper financial incentives. And property rights are closely tied to financial incentives. We give people the ability to profit from their property, and they will use property in a remarkable way that helps to promote economic growth. Property rights and the defense of those property rights are incredibly important things, as is political stability. Political stability refers to the idea that anytime there's a change in leadership, it goes smoothly. There aren't riots. There aren't gun battles in the streets if your political candidate doesn't win. You say, well, I'm not happy about this, but we'll do better next time. We'll try again next time. Political stability is really important, in part because of the impact it's going to have on the last thing that I want to talk about on our list of what promotes economic growth. So we'll get back to this idea of political stability here in just a minute. Having competitive markets is also a hugely important feature of good economic institutions. It's an incredibly important economic institutions. As we saw when we studied competition. Competition leads to lower prices for consumers, which is really good. It leads to efficiency. It leads to efficient production because you have to produce in the lowest cost way. It leads to the innovation of industries. It leads to new ideas. It leads to just a more vibrant and healthy economy. Trade, specifically trade with other countries, is another institution, another thing that people agree that they want to have that leads to a lot of economic growth. And we can look very specifically at countries like South Korea. We can look at countries like Singapore and Taiwan and Hong Kong. These countries were known in the 80s as the Asian Tigers. These countries that had enormous economic growth rates because primarily they had opened their borders to trade. If you know anything about these four countries, they're very small and they don't have a lot of natural resources. They invested in human capital significantly, but they also focused their attention and their economic identity on being countries that would trade with anybody. This in part leads to the realization in other parts of the world how important trade can be. So we have, for example, the European Union, where trade barriers are reduced. And we have the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, where trade barriers are reduced. These are important things, important institutions, and we'll talk more about trade when we get into international economics. But trade is an institution, a rule of the game. Do you allow trade? Do you allow a lot of trade? Do you put barriers to trade in place? And the more trade you have, it seems to be the more economic growth you have. Efficient taxes are important, or are an important institution. So taxes that people are willing to pay, taxes that people will will pay, maybe not happily, but they will pay them. As opposed to finding ways and using your resources to avoid paying taxes. If tax rates are high enough, people will spend more resources avoiding the taxes than they will actually paying the taxes, and that just means you're wasting resources. And then finally, the last thing I want to put on this list is a stable money supply, or just stable money generally. We see in some parts of the world, parts like Venezuela, and like Zimbabwe, where the money is not stable, where the value of it fluctuates wildly. Economic activity is made more difficult because you have to consider whether or not you want to trade with money. And if you don't trade with money, what are you going to trade with? And you might end up in a barter economy, and that's just really inefficient. A stable monetary system or a stable monetary regime is really an important aspect of economic institutions. It's one of the reasons why none of you were assigned the Venezuelan bolivar, because the value of that money is so utterly uncertain that it's likely that you would all, if you had that currency assigned to you, you would have no value. You might actually owe me money by the end of the semester because the value of that money changes so rapidly and dramatically. So these are just some of the institutions that are important in terms of economic growth. Economic institutions, or just institutions generally, are looked at as ways to structure your economy, that set up the rules of the game that are going to lead to vibrant economic growth, or at least consistent economic growth, if you hold to these institutions. The last thing I want to put on our list here, as far as what promotes economic growth, is something we're going to talk a lot more about after your exam. And that is investment. I mentioned under the list of institutions the importance of political stability. One of the reasons political stability is so important is because if you don't have it, people are not going to invest in your country. Investment, as we'll talk about again after the exam, is moving money into the hands of businesses so that they can grow their business, so that they can hire more people, so they can produce more things. That doesn't happen just overnight, and it almost never happens once you get to a certain size with the funding or the savings of the person who founded the business. They need resources from other people. They need a source of capital or a source of money in order to grow their business. If you don't have a politically stable country, then that investment is very unlikely to actually happen, because people don't want their money going to a country that isn't stable, because they may never see it again. We'll get into those types of relationships and kind of what that means when we talk more about the financial system and what that means for investment. But we'll do that after your exam. So for now, these are the 4 things that we're going to look at as far as promoting economic growth: resources, technology, institutions, and investment. So that's pretty much it for economic growth. Economic growth is really kind of the culmination of the macroeconomics that we've been studying. And it's important because it so directly, more so than most things in macro, impact people's lives. If we can improve standards of living, that's a huge accomplishment. That's why so many economists are trying to figure out what can be done to promote economic growth. We have this list of things that we just covered, and it makes it sound like, oh, economic growth is easy. But it isn't easy, to be sure. Politics and social norms and economics don't always get along well. And so just simply dropping a set of institutions on a country, or dropping natural resources or physical capital on a country, doesn't mean that it's going to grow. Usually there's got to be some I hate to say it, but some like magic combination of those things in order for economic growth to occur. We started off by looking at some pictures of economic growth and kind of what that looks like. And we saw in North and South Korea the dramatic difference between what a country with an advanced economy and a country with an economy that really hasn't changed in the last 60 years looks like. The standard of living of people in those two parts of the world are enormously different, even though they just live across the border from each other. There's no doubt that South Korea has adopted a path of economic growth that has allowed its population to experience an enormous advance in standards of living. In 1960, both of those countries, North and South Korea, were almost on the same footing. They were just coming out of a bitter and brutal civil war. Standards of living were very low. But the different paths that those two countries have taken illustrate perhaps better than anything else that even if you start from the same place in terms of natural resources, human capital, and technology, that by adopting the right kinds of institutions that promote economic growth, you will have two just incredibly different outcomes. So, as you think about the type of world we live in, one of the things we need to concern ourselves with is what kind of institutions do we adopt, because that can lead to very different outcomes. And those institutions have an enormous role to play in the standard of living that we will experience as people into the future. That wraps up our material for the next exam. What I'm going to do in the next couple of videos is, first of all, go through the problem set, and secondly, work our way through an illustration of a country that has experienced economic growth in a very unique way.